In this video, I'll be looking at unit tests, job interview programming tests, and the core competency tests. So a lot about testing apparently. So unit tests, I'm sure you've had in other classes. So basically you do unit tests when you want to test individual components, and often they're individual functions or procedures just to make sure they work. So it's kind of not a good idea to write a whole program and then assume that everything's working. So if you're writing a procedure that does some matrix factorization, you want to, and converting some math formula, let's say, to some code, you want to make sure that actually works by testing it rather than just assume that you did the code correctly. Similarly, if you're working on a Flask Postgres application that does some shopping site, and you're trying to finalize an order, you want to make sure that the code that computes the total cost of that order actually works, not just assume that, yeah, that looks right. So you want to do various tests. And often it's the case that you start writing these unit tests before you write the actual functions that it's going to be testing. So often the tests come before these functions that you're writing. A related, or maybe not related, topic is job interview programming tests. A lot of times for larger companies, they interview you, they look at your resume, they interview you, you get a job. But for other companies, especially startups, a really critical part, the main part of an interview is the actual programming test. So that procedure, particularly at startups, goes something like this. They look over your resume, they might give you, if your resume looks good, they'll give you a phone call, chat with you, just to see if they can get along with you, if you're kind of a nice person or whatever, that, something connects with you. Then they'll conduct this in-person interview with developers just to kind of see, hey, kind of furthering this phone interview idea. Do you get along with other people? Do you seem like a reasonable person? And then the real main part is an actual coding test. They'll ask you, well, bring your laptop with you, your favorite coding environment. They'll stash you in a room somewhere. You have a couple hours, and they'll give you an API to implement, or they'll give you some programming task. And if you're applying for a back-end developer position, you're often given this API. Here's this API, please code it. They'll have some front end that they can run and test it, but you're working there in that room coding it. And maybe midway through this, at least for the people I've talked to when they've been working on or doing this for jobs that they've interviewed for, they'll change this API a bit. Like, oh, wait, we made a mistake. We want now, instead of just logging in this way, we want to do this other method of login or whatever, just to make sure your code isn't brittle, that you're having good programming style, that you can make changes quickly. So the core competency test really is a way of practicing for this developer test. So, and it's designed to be easy if you understood Socket.io, mostly PostgreSQL. If you were kind of humming along and understanding what you were coding, it's going to be a fairly easy ride for you, especially after you watch this video. And really, it's totally designed to be just like these developer tests, or similar, or give you similar style of what you need to do. And like a developer test, it's going to be timed, that you just have a few hours to do this test. So it's a good addition to traditional exams you've had in other classes. There's a place for those traditional exams. At interviews, you may be asked questions that are similar to those on an exam. For example, I was asked at a job interview, if you have a million entries of, it's an ontology, a job I was applying for, so there's a million entries of animals related to some other million set of something else. How do you do a union of those two sets? What's the algorithm to do that? So that's where, traditional knowledge is good, but certainly these programming tests are really a vital complement to the traditional tests you've been taking. And particularly, we're going to be looking at Socket.io and PostgreSQL. So let's take a look at it. So given an API, let's code it. So the idea would be like this. So here's an API for just dealing with our world SQL database. And we're going to have some events. The API consists of events. So this is a very simple one, not a very realistic one, that I want you to handle this event called echo. It's going to take some key value pair, and you're going to emit this event echo result with this same thing that was passed to you. So you just take the argument, the key and the value, and pass it back to this event echo result. A more interesting one would be this handling this event country population. The argument's going to be the key's country. The value of that key is going to be some name of the country. And if the country exists, you're going to emit this event country population result with the argument of whatever the population is here. And we do some tests. If the country doesn't exist, you'll generate some error. You'll emit this query error with the argument error, country does not exist. If the arguments are wrong, similarly, you'll get an error. So we'll create this API, or you may be given in a test this API of what you need to code. And that's kind of the syntax of how it might look. So here's my code to handle that API, or the start of it. And I have this standard stuff at the beginning that we've looked at before. I'm trying to make this video a little faster, so I'm not typing, I'm just showing. Here's the Socket.io connect. The echo, remember, was you get some, here's handling echo, you get some argument and you just echo it back. So I'm taking in an argument and here I'm just echoing it. The interesting thing about this code, the part I want to point out, is this unit test. So I'm going to test every component right within Python. I don't need to write a front end to do my tests. I can do it in the same in Python without developing some HTML front end JavaScript thing. So here I make my connection with my client. Here's where I'm testing echo. So this client's emitting this event echo with this pair. Remember, then this would get passed back up here to echo. Echo's emitting echo result with args. Here I'm just printing to show you what the thing that when we get a result back, what that actually looks like. I check to make sure that we actually got something. It just wasn't empty. Else I'm going to print out this message echo failed. This is just the number just to help me see where I'm failing. This assert statement in Python means that assert that this statement here has to be true. So I actually have to receive something. If not, if this isn't true, then I'll print out this message, whatever it is, the second argument here, and halt the program with an error. So that's what this assert statement means. Check if this is true. If it is, continue down to the rest of the statements. If it's not true, print out this message, halt. So here I check to make sure that we do have something. Here I'm checking to see if what my program is emitting is an event called echo result. If not, I'm printing out that message. Here I'm making sure that if I pass in test key, I'm getting that test key, test value back. And let me just run that just to show you that that works. And that was called World 1. And here's that printout of what I'm getting, the result. You can see the name is echo result, which is what the API is called for. Emit echo result. And the args where this, whatever I took in, I'm getting back. So now let me look at more about my unit tests. So here I've created a test for country population. Remember, according to the API, it's going to take this argument country with some name of a country. And if the country exists, it's going to emit this event country population result with this argument. Else it doesn't. If it doesn't exist, it's going to give me an error. Or if the arguments are wrong, it's going to give me a different error. So that's what all these tests are doing here. So before I wrote any code to handle this, I'm actually writing the tests first. So here I'm just doing the simple case. So I'm calling country population, that event, with the argument country, Japan. I get information back from my code, which will be written up above here. Make sure I get something back. Check if what I get back is country population result. That's what's specified in the API. If the country exists, give me country population result with argument whatever the population is. So that's here, country population result. And here I make sure I get the correct population. Here I'm testing the next case, what happens if the country doesn't exist. And I'm also testing to make sure, that these funky characters like this apostrophe are handled fine, that they don't crash my program. So again, I send that off. I get the results back. I make sure I have a result. I make sure that in this case I should be admitting the query error. I know that because that's what the API says. If the country doesn't exist, I should admit query error with the argument error, country does not exist. And that's where I check here in this line, country does not exist, and so on. So here is a case where I'm checking a quote semicolon. So I'm trying to come up with examples where my code might fail, not just test it once with a simple example. That would be silly testing. I want to think, well, how can this fail? What would be the ways of making it fail? So that's what I do, and so I make all these unit tests for all those functions before I actually wrote them. All right, and to save time, I'm not typing the answers in. I'm just showing you what I step-by-step kind of snapshots of things. So here's my first implementation. So my traditional connected database function. Here I make a simple handle country population. So I'm making a connection, getting the cursor, grab that argument from that event's being sent to me. So I'm getting that country. Here I'm constructing the query. I try to execute the query. And if I'm successful, or always in this case, I'm emitting country population result with whatever that population is. Again, I know I need to do this because that's what's specified in the API, right? If the country exists, country population result. So that's this world 2. Let me run that. There's some error, but let me go up here. So you can see echo appears to work. I'm starting my country population test. Japan test passed. Okay, so Japan test passed. I know that was right here. So that part worked fine. It's here that I goofed. So knowing that, I can try to find out what I did wrong. And you probably already know what I did wrong, or at least one of the things I did wrong was do this bad query, not to put a value judgment on things, but it's not the correct way of doing things. And I screwed up because of that quote. It's not doing correct escaping. So I now have fixed things with this version. So now instead of that Python, I use the cursor object itself to create the query, right? So I use this curmography to create a string. I try to execute it. And here's where if the country exists, I return it. If it doesn't exist, I generate that error. If country does not exist, say query error with argument error, country does not exist. So now I've added this if-else statement. So if I do get a result, print that result, else emit this query error. Let me run that one. All right, let's see if we got a little further. So I got Japan test passed. Well, let's go all the way to the top. This echo, as always, works. Nothing happened to it. So I'm starting this country population test. The plain Japan test passed. With the quotes, they passed. There's 2 tests there. The one with J apostrophe Japan and the other with apostrophe semicolon. Those passed fine. It's the last test that didn't pass. So let's take a look at that. Here's where I'm passing in no arguments, so it's an argument error, and I don't handle that here. So that's why I'm getting that key error. So here I change things a little more. So if I do have an argument called country, I execute the code that I previously had, else I'm going to say incorrect arguments, or I'm going to emit this query error with incorrect arguments. And all this is the same as before. And that's Python World 4. Okay, echo appears to work. I'm starting my country population test. Japan test passed. Quote test 1. Bad arguments test passed. Country population appears to work. So things seem to work fine there. So now I'm starting my capital of test. That one, the requirement was I give it some country. It's going to give me the city that it's the capital of with. And if the country doesn't exist, the same error, if the arguments are incorrect. I didn't implement that, but you get the idea now that, as we're developing, we see tests being passed, and we can also test if I develop something here that screws up something up here. I'll get that message that all of a sudden now there's a regression, that something broke that was working. So these unit tests are a pretty spectacular way of doing stuff. So that's it. I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of what's the core competency test is like. Why I'm doing that is because it mirrors pretty much what you might find in a job interview when they ask you to do some coding. It's not like a scary thing, the core competency. It's not like, oh, this is some new wacky thing that it's going to be difficult. It's just testing that what you say you know or what you've been practicing, that you actually learn, that you just didn't find some solution on the net and printed it out. So that's it for this video. I hope it was short. We'll find out in a second. Take care. Bye.